Say awake, awake, put on your strength, O Zion, put on your beautiful garments, O Jerusalem, the holy city, shake off the dust and arise.
I hope you'll join me for the next few weeks as we study the life of the early disciples after Yeshua's ascension. We're going to study their lives, how they lived, how they worshiped, and what happened to them. We're studying what formed these early disciples, what pressures were brought to bear on them and on Yeshua during his ministry. What kinds of things did they have to fight against? Things like, who were the Pharisees, the Sadducees, and what problems did these folks present for Yeshua and the early congregations? We all want to be like those early disciples and belong to congregations like theirs. So let's study and find out what that means. So this is actually week 6 of this study of the early believers. Remember last week we spoke about the importance of the temple services to the people of Israel. All the Jewish people, to include the new sect that we've been talking about of Judaism that emerged in the first century, the sect of the Nazarenes, who also called themselves the Way. And we looked at how they continued on in the temple after the day of Pentecost to meet daily in the temple courts. And I want to continue with this thought today as we're going to touch on one of the major factors for the first century congregations as we have been studying. And that is the destruction of the temple. We'll get to that today. Acts chapter 3 and verse 1 says, On one day Peter and John were going up to the temple at the time of prayer at 3 p.m. Now a man crippled from birth was being carried to the temple gate called Beautiful, where he was put every day to beg from those going into the temple courts. And notice that it says that he's going up to the temple at the time of prayer. And this was the time when the people of Israel would literally stop their activities and everyone would say the temple prayers, which according to the rabbis at that time consisted of the 10 Commandments, which the rabbis will later, after the destruction of the temple, remove from the service, as they didn't want the 10 to be thought of more than the rest of the commands. And they blamed this on a group called the Manim, or the heretics, who were trying to put forth that the 10 were more important than the rest. And we'll look at that later when we examine Judaism and the believers after the destruction of the temple. They also consisted of the standing prayer and the Shema and its blessings. The Amidah, or the standing prayer, well, it's much the same, has changed somewhat since those days, in that portions which ask for the temple service to be restored have been added. And for a time, just after the first century, they also had a blessing which was actually a curse against the Nazarenes, who will be called by that time by the rabbis the Manim, or in English the heretics. The Shema, of course, is the same. It's because it's part of Scripture, but the blessings are a little different as well. And so what we see Peter and John doing here in this passage is exactly what we spoke of last week. They're continuing on in the temple services. And this is also the time of the daily sacrifices, the burnt offerings that will be offered day and night. This is the worship of God, and we'll talk more about that later. Besides joining in with the prayers, we read this in verse 11. While the beggar held onto Peter and John, all the people were astonished and came running to them in the place called Solomon's Colonnade. When Peter saw this, he said to them, Men of Israel, why does this surprise you? Why do you stare at us as if by our own power or godliness we made this man walk? The God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of our fathers, has glorified his servant Yeshua. And so they went to the temple courts also to teach and to preach, as there was a large gathering of people for these services. And on an evangelistic note, they could speak to large gatherings of people in the temple. And it was also a place where they could gather. There was enough room for them to gather. The congregation at this time numbered in the thousands, and so it was one of the few places where they could congregate. They could gather together. They healed this man in the name of Yeshua, and the people are surprised. And this is going to cause trouble. First, because of the way they're preaching. And second, they're actually working miracles in the temple. And this was going to alarm the priests. The reason being, at this time, very few miracles are happening in the temple, except those being done by the disciples. Now, the other thing is the message. It's a direct attack against the Sanhedrin. I'm going to read this for you in chapter 3, in verse 13. You handed him over to be killed. You disowned him before Pilate, though he had decided to let him go. You disowned the holy and righteous one and asked that a murderer be released to you. You killed the author of life, but God raised him from the dead. We are witnesses of this. But by faith in the name of Yeshua, this man whom you see and had known was made strong. It's Yeshua's name and faith that comes through him that has given him complete healing to him, as you can all see. Now, brothers, I know that you acted in ignorance, as did your leaders. But this is how God fulfilled what he foretold through all the prophets, saying that his Messiah would suffer. Repent then, turn to God, so that your sins may be wiped out, that times of refreshing may come from the Lord, that he may send the Messiah who has been appointed for you, even Yeshua. He must remain in heaven until the time comes for God to restore everything, as he promised long ago through the holy prophets. For Moses said, the Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among your own people. You must listen to everything he tells you. Anyone who does not listen to him will be completely cut off from among his people. And so here's the result of this message in chapter 4. We have, they're going to be brought before the Sanhedrin for healing this man and this message. They're forbidden to preach in the name of Yeshua any longer. And if we pick up in chapter 5, we're going to get some key pieces of information. Chapter 5, verse 12 says, the apostles performed many miracles and signs and wonders among the people, and all the believers used to meet together in Solomon's colonnade. No one else dared join them, even though they were highly regarded by the people. Nevertheless, more and more men and women believed in the Lord and were added to their number. As a result, people brought sick into the streets and laid them on beds and mats, so that at least Peter's shadow might fall on some of them as he passed by. Crowds gathered also from the towns around Jerusalem, bringing their sick and those tormented by evil spirits, and all of them were healed. And then the high priest and all of his associates, who were members of the party of the Sadducees, were filled with jealousy. And so even though they're forbidden, they were arrested, they continue. And as we can see, the leaders are jealous, and for a good reason. The people should be coming to them for these things. But there's no power in the ministry of these leaders. Let's read just a bit farther, and we'll get another key piece of information. Verse 18 says, they arrested the apostles, put them in public jail, but during the night an angel of the Lord opened the doors of the jail and brought them out. Go, stand in the temple courts, he said, and tell the people the full message of this new life. At daybreak they entered the temple courts as they had been told and began to teach the people. And so even though they've been arrested, even though they're forbidden, they don't stop preaching about Yeshua, as they have now the leading of the Spirit, and it gives them a new boldness. However, this freedom within the temple is going to change over time, as we're going to see in a moment. We touched on it last week, as the Sanhedrin will become bolder and will arrest some of the apostles and even put them to death. But note that it says here in verse 20, because it gives us confirmation of sort of our decision about the name, the way. Remember, we talked about they were named this, they called themselves this because they had a new way to walk out the commands of life. And it was the commands of God. It was a new way of life. And as the verse says, tell them the full message of this new life. You see, these were followers of the way, and they were quite vocal. Their message will be one that will be an affront to the priests in the things that they're doing, like healing. Also, the message will be a condemnation to the leaders who were responsible for putting Yeshua to death. And finally, their message is going to be challenging for the Pharisees, as they're actually preaching a new way, a new halakha of walking by the Spirit of God, walking out the commands by the Spirit of God, and not the rules of the Pharisees. They're truly being disciples of Yeshua, fully trained by their master. And so we can see that the temple was extremely important to the worship, but also as an outreach, both to Jerusalem and in the diaspora. If we look at just one verse in Acts chapter 2, we can see how an important a tool this was going to be for witnessing Yeshua and spreading the good news through the diaspora. Acts chapter 2 and verse 5 says, "Now there were staying in Jerusalem God-fearing Jews from every nation under heaven." And so this, of course, is happening at the festival of Shavuot. And at festivals, men would come from all over the diaspora for the services that were commanded by God. And so as you can imagine, this would be a tremendous opportunity to witness to people, and they would take that good news back out to the diaspora. If you remember from the account of James' death that we looked at last week, what time did it happen at? It happened at Passover, and they were in fear of the message that was going to be preached by the disciples. The temple was so much a part of these men's lives that it worked their way into their messages and their letters, both plainly spoken of and also in allusions. We're going to look at a couple of those. If you've been to the temple study, we just went through the offerings that were made in the temple, and we spoke of a Hebrew word for offering. It's the word korban. And it's the word that's translated offering or sacrifice in our Bibles, but it really doesn't mean offering or sacrifice. And I put the word up here. Korban means something brought near the altar. It comes from the root word karab, which means to approach, to draw near, to be at hand, to be near. It means something brought near. The root word means to approach, to be near. The offerings were given to the people to teach them to draw near to God once they had been separated through sin or whatever. Paul knew the temple services and the meaning of this word, and so we can see that he makes allusion to these things in Ephesians chapter 2 and verse 11. Listen to what it says. "Therefore remember that formerly you who are Gentiles by birth and called uncircumcised by those who call themselves the circumcision, that done in the body by hands of men. Remember that at that time you were separate from Messiah, excluded from citizenship in Israel, and foreigners to the covenants of promise, without hope, without God in the world. But now in Messiah Yeshua, you who were far away have been brought near through the blood of Messiah. For he himself is our peace. He has made the two one and has destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility." And notice it says that he says, you have been brought near karab by the blood of Messiah, or we could say by the offering of Messiah, our korban. Paul is using allusions to the temple offerings to make his point. But also the temple itself, because he says he's destroyed the barrier, the dividing wall of hostility. And that's another allusion to the temple, because the temple had a lattice fence that separated what was called the court of the Gentiles from the inner courts. And on that lattice fence were plaques that were placed there by the priests and the Pharisees. And these plaques read, "Gentiles who go beyond this point take their own lives in their hands." The priests and the Pharisees had put this barrier between God and the Gentiles. And this is what Paul is accused of in Acts chapter 21 when he's accused of taking a non-Jew past that fence into the inner courts of the temple. You know, we 21st believers miss many of these points because we don't have any understanding of the temple. And that's why that temple study is so important. Listen to James. He'll use some of the same imagery. James in chapter 4 and verse 7 says, "Submit yourselves then to God. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Come near to God and he will come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts, you double-minded. Grieve, mourn, and wail. Change your laughter to mourning, your joy to gloom. Humble yourselves before the Lord, and he will lift you up." All of those things go back to temple imagery. Come near to God, and he'll come near to you. Wash your hands, you sinners. Purify your hearts. The temple was the center for purification of sinners. And I bring this up to show you that besides the obvious references to the temple and the tabernacle, we have all these allusions that we don't sometimes see but they show us the importance of the temple to these disciples. As Shaul and the others taught of the temple, as they went out into the diaspora, they taught the non-Jews about the temple. They would learn of the importance of the temple as well. The temple for these men was where the worship of God took place for those living in Jerusalem. And we're going to see this refrain by Shaul in Romans chapter 9, beginning with verse 1. He says, I speak the truth in Messiah. I'm not lying. My conscience confirms it in the Holy Spirit. I have a great sorrow and unceasing anguish in my heart, for I could wish that I myself were cursed and cut off from Messiah for the sake of my brothers, those of my own race, the people of Israel. Theirs is the adoption as sons. Theirs the divine glory, the covenants, the receiving of the law, the temple worship, and the promises. Theirs are the patriarchs, and from them is traced the human ancestry of Messiah, who is God over all, praised forever. Amen. You see, the temple worship was important to Shaul as the covenants, new and old, the Torah, and the promises of God. What most don't realize is that we just spoke of the worship of God, because the worship of God consisted of these daily offerings, the burnt offerings morning and evening, the daily prayers, the psalms that were sung by the priest. Those things we saw Peter and John attending. And so these things are on the hearts of the disciples as they go out to preach. And they were on the hearts of the people of Israel who were not disciples. Because the temple and the Torah were on the hearts of the disciples, the temple naturally, as we have seen, made its way into their sermons, made its way into their messages and their letters. And so it went out to the Gentiles, and they were made to realize the importance of the temple as well. Not to the same degree, of course, that the Jewish people living in the land, because those things would be somewhat foreign to them like they are to us, because we're not able to attend those services. And they weren't because of the distance, and they weren't also because of the rulers had erected this barrier. And so they can only hear of the temple in messages and in synagogue readings of the Torah, but they know the importance of this temple. It was the disciples' proximity to the temple and their living in Jerusalem, as well as their knowledge of the Word and the life of Messiah, that made the disciples of Jerusalem the congregational head of the assemblies, the ones the diaspora assemblies looked to for direction. There was another reason that the temple was so important to all of the sects of Judaism, to include the followers of the way. And Scarson touches on it in his book, and so I put this quote up here from the book. The other main concept that explains the religious significance of the temple is that of the atonement of the sacrifices brought in the temple. Simon the just high priest, circa 200 BC, said, "On three things does the world stand: on the Torah, on the temple services, and on deeds of loving kindness." It is clear that this learned man considered the atoning sacrifices offered in the temple to be indispensable to Israel's relationship with God. And when the temple fell in 70 AD, both rabbinic and Christian sources testify that the most irksome question asked was, how could the people now obtain remission for their sins? You see, we 21st century disciples and believers, because of this cloud of centuries, have a cloud of centuries of misunderstanding, fail to realize the importance of the offerings. And it's ironic because we get our doctrine of their being unimportant from the book of Hebrews. And we fail to realize why the book of Hebrews was actually written, and I touched on it a few weeks ago. The book of Hebrews is written by a Hellenist Jew living in Rome to comfort the Hebrews living in the land. And he's comforting them because they're losing access to the temple, and particularly the Day of Atonement. Many of the believers will have lost access to the temple long before its destruction, and we saw why last week and earlier in this session. They're challenging the Pharisees and the priests, and the resultant jealousy of the temple authorities will cause them to lose access to the temple. And so this book of Hebrews is a letter written to comfort the Hebrews for the loss of the temple. And if we examine it briefly, we can see what the loss of the temple meant for not only the disciples in Jerusalem, but other Jews as well. With just a cursory understanding of the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur, you can begin to see what the purpose of this letter was. The most important man in all of Israel was the high priest. And he officiated on the most important day in the entire calendar year, the Day of Atonement. On the Day of Atonement, all the sins that Israel had committed unknowingly through the year were atoned for through these offerings. And God would grant peace to the people for the coming year and make a cleansing of the temple for the sins of Israel. The offerings of the high priest would come in two forms. First, a bull for his entire household. It would be offered and its blood would be taken into the Holy of Holies. Second offering would be 2 goats. And lots would be drawn to determine the fate of these 2 goats. One of the lots would be for the Lord, and the other lot would be for Azazel, who was a demon who inhabited the wilderness. And the goat whose lot fell to the Lord would be offered to the Lord. His blood, his life would be taken into the Holy of Holies and sprinkled on the mercy seat, just like the bull's blood had been. Now, the interesting part comes in with the other goat. The goat for Azazel would have a red cord tied around its horn. And it will also have part of that red cord tied to a pole in the temple. And then the goat will be led out of the temple, out into the wilderness to a high cliff. And he would be pushed backward off the cliff to its death. And the interesting thing is that there was a miracle that occurred in conjunction with this death of the goat and this cord. As we're going to read, I'm going to read it this is from the Talmud Yoma. Part of the crimson string was displayed in the Beit HaMikdash. When the goat went to its death at Azazel, the people knew that their sins were forgiven. When the scarlet string in the Beit HaMikdash miraculously turned white. And so here's the thing. As the priest left the temple on Yom Kippur, leading this goat to this high cliff, the people would wait. And they would be watching this cord, waiting for it to turn white, telling them that all was well, that their sins were forgiven, that God had accepted all the offerings of the day, and they had prosperity for another year. It was a sign from God for the people. And then the people would sing and dance and rejoice and prepare for the joyous festival that was coming just 5 days later, the Feast of Tabernacles. The problem is this. The Talmud states that for 40 years preceding the destruction of the temple, that red cloth never turned white. And the lot for the Lord, which used to come up always in the right hand, never came up in the right hand again. And we read this from the Talmud. Our rabbis taught during the last 40 years before the destruction of the temple, the lot for the Lord did not come up in the right hand, nor did the crimson-colored cloth become white. Now, the temple was destroyed in 70 Common Era, and if we go 40 years back, we come to 30 Common Era. And after 30 Common Era, that crimson tie never turned white again. Remember, it was symbolic of God accepting Israel's offerings on Yom Kippur. So something happened in 30 Common Era that God never accepted these offerings again. Of course, we know that Messiah died at that time. But can you imagine the concern and the horror of the people in the very first year that cord didn't turn white? And then in every subsequent year? So now you can begin to imagine the concern of a nation and the disciples as well. Not only were the disciples concerned about losing access to the temple, but after the Yom Kippur services, they were further concerned because they saw that the offerings weren't being accepted. The Lord was not pleased. And if this continued, judgment was in the air. And so this is the mood as the writer of Hebrews writes this letter to the Hebrews in the land. They no longer have access to the temple and this all-important service on Yom Kippur, nor the daily services, and it appears that God is upset. No doubt the words of Yeshua were echoing in their minds. From Luke chapter 21 and verse 5, it says that some of the disciples were remarking about how the temple was adorned with beautiful stones and with gifts dedicated to God. But Yeshua said, "As for what you see here, the time will come when not one stone will be left on another, for every one will be thrown down." And so, what I want you to see, this is the backdrop of the letter to the Hebrews. And the themes, if we look at the themes in the letters, it confirms this. Let's just look at a few passages from the book of Hebrews. Chapter 4 and verse 14 says, "Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has gone through the heavens, Yeshua, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. For we do not have a high priest who is unable to sympathize with our weaknesses, but we have one who has been tempted in every way just as we are, and yet was without sin. Let us then approach the throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need." You see, this high priest was all important on this day, and to the people in general. But he was persecuting the disciples by this time. But he, like no other, was important because he presided between God and them on this day. He performed nearly the entire temple services. He offered the animals on this day of atonement. He lit the menorah. He offered the prayers. He drew the lots. He went into the Holy of Holies. These things were things that other priests did on other days. So they've got to be asking themselves, how can a high priest, the one who goes into the Holy of Holies, the same one who put the Lord to death, go into the Holy of Holies and come back out and not die? Is this why the offerings were not accepted there? You can almost hear what they're thinking. Not only that, the high priest at this time, is, like I say, is persecuting the disciples. How can he do this? How can he emerge from the Holy of Holies after putting some of the disciples to death with these terrible sins in his life? And so the writer of Hebrews assures them, you have a high priest that can sympathize. And he continues with this same theme in chapter 7 and verse 11. If perfection could have been attained through the Levitical priesthood, for on the basis of it the law was given to the people, why was there still need for another priest to come, one in the order of Melchizedek and not in the order of Aaron? The writer tells us that the priesthood, while it served its purpose, was really a shadow of the high priest Yeshua in the order of Melchizedek. Now, the next passage in chapter 9, leaves us a little doubt as to the purpose of the letter. Now, listen to this. In verse 11, when Messiah came as high priest of the good things that are already here, he went through a greater and more perfect tabernacle that is not man-made, that is to say, not part of this creation. He did not enter by means of the blood of goats and calves, but he entered the most holy place once and for all by his own blood, having obtained eternal redemption. The blood of goats and bulls and the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean sanctify them so that they are clean outwardly. How much more than the blood of Messiah, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, to cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, that we may serve the living God. And the writer assures the Hebrews living in the land that it's not the blood of goats and bulls offered on Yom Kippur for the sins of people that made them truly clean, but what made them truly clean is the blood of Messiah. And look at how he states it now. This is important. Look at how he states it. He states it this way: the blood of goats and bulls, the ashes of a heifer sprinkled on those who are ceremonially unclean, sanctify them so that they are outwardly clean. How much more then will the blood of Messiah, who through the eternal Spirit offered himself unblemished to God, cleanse our consciences from acts that lead to death, so that we may serve the living God? He's using an argument style of the day called Kol Vachomer. And it argues from the less important to the greater important. And what it does, begins by showing the great importance of the blood of goats and bulls offered on Yom Kippur, in that they cleanse the people outwardly. And then he's saying, hey, these offerings were important, but how much more the offering of Yeshua? By acknowledging the importance of the blood of goats and bulls, he shows the supreme importance of the offering of Messiah.